Our moderator is Rose Scott. She is an award-winning journalist and the host of Closer Look on National Public Radio here in Atlanta. We are very fortunate to have her. It was very gracious of her to agree to do this. She has won the Georgia Associated Press Award, the Southeastern Regional Emmy Award, she's smiling but well-deserved, and the Atlanta Association of Black Journalists Award, and the Edward R. Murrow Award, and many others. Please help me welcome Rose Scott.
Wow, thank you, Denise, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the Gwinnett Public Library. I hope you all can hear me. I will tell you that I live with two mangy cats. I have tried to hide them. I don't know what's going to happen doing this, but if you hear some meowing, it's not me, it's not Stacey, it's probably the cats. But I want to thank you all for joining in. And I know under the old way, we would all be under, one roof, or we'd all be in one room. But, we're in a new norm for now. But thanks to technology, we're all here. And I'm looking forward to this next conversation. More than 5 years ago, when WABE launched Closer Look, my very first one-on-one interview for the program was with Stacey Abrams, who was then the Georgia House Minority Leader. But how things have changed. Stacey has catapulted into the political arena. She's on the cover of Time magazine. She's writing books and all this stuff and inspiring a lot of folks to not only exercise their constitutional right to vote, but to vote for justice when they feel that right is being compromised. And as a journalist, my job is to do the reporting. My job is not to change minds, but my job is to inform. And so I've always been encouraged when we have people, regardless of political affiliation, we have people who are fighting for the right side of what we call democracy. And you know what? There's a backstory to this innate leadership that Stacey Abrams possesses. And I don't say that because I'm just about to interview her. I say that because it's true. I say it because it comes across clear in the narrative with her latest book, Our Time Is Now. And before we get into our conversation, we're going to allow Stacey to kick off tonight's conversation. And she'll give just a brief little introductory about the book and sort of, what was that thread that made her decide to even tackle this. So Stacey, it's yours.
Well, Rose, thank you so much. And thank you to the Gwinnett Public Library. Miriam, thank you for such a kind introduction of the work that we're doing. And thank you to all of you for showing up. I wrote Our Time Is Now in the wake of the 2018 election. I was asked by a number of publishers to do a retrospective about the campaign, to ruminate about what happened, and to use this as a cathartic moment. And my answer was no. I lived it. I was there. I didn't need to talk about it again that way. But the more I had conversations with voters, with folks around the country, but particularly here in Georgia and in other places where the right to vote was challenged, I realized that part of the context of my story was understanding the arc of voter suppression in our country. But that's only part of the story. There's where voter suppression began, it's what it looks like now. But what was most important to me, what is adult life, was to think about what's next. How do you not just identify and diagnose the problem, but how do you fix it? I'm the daughter of two United Methodist ministers. But for most of my growing up, my parents were a librarian. My mom was a librarian. My dad was a shipyard worker. They were people who struggled to make ends meet despite doing all the things they were supposed to do. My mom was the only child of her 7 siblings to finish high school, the only one to go to college, the only one to go to grad school. And yet sometimes she made less money than the janitor who cleaned the college where she led the library. My dad was a shipyard worker. He grew up in segregated Mississippi along with my mom. My dad's challenge was that he had a learning disability that went undiagnosed until he was 30. And so my dad memorized his way through school, became the first man in his family to go to college, and yet armed with a college degree and a brilliant mind, he could not get a job in an office. And so my dad did important, noble work. He was a shipyard worker, but it was work that he had to take because he could not get the work he could do. And they could have become bitter. They could have raised us to be bitter because we still lived on the edge of poverty. Sometimes we tumbled off that edge. But more than anything, they wanted us to understand that our capacity wasn't going to be defined by our circumstances. Our capacity was going to be defined by what we were willing to do to change the narrative. That's why they made certain we were grounded in a religious ethic, because they wanted us to have a faith in something larger than ourselves, but also a moral core to guide our decisions. They grounded us in education, which is why we saw them at the age of 40 go and become United Methodist ministers by attending Emory University. At the age of 40, with 6 kids in tow, my parents went back to grad school, and they did well. But they also taught us to take care of each other, to have a community commitment. And it wasn't just about taking care of my 5 brothers and sisters. We all were committed to one another. They told us that our job was to serve those around us. And so even though we had no running water or the lights got cut off, my parents would take us out to volunteer. They would take us with them to be in service. And they would say having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing. And as much as my parents had us volunteering and they took us out to protest, my parents took us with them to vote every single time. We looked, as I talk about in the book, we looked like make way for ducklings as we trailed out the voting booth at Anniston Avenue Elementary. But my mom and dad wanted us to understand that voting was as powerful as any protest, as critical as any service, because voting is how, as a citizen, we make our voices heard. They also wanted us to understand how hard fought that right was. They never told us we had an obligation to vote because people had died for the right, but they wanted us to understand what those deaths meant. They wanted us to understand why it mattered that my dad was arrested at the age of 14, registering African Americans to vote in Mississippi, doing work that he believed was right. We like to tease him that my mom was doing the same work across town. She was just smart enough not to get caught. Overall, what they wanted us to know, and what I carry into this moment, is a commitment not simply to the act of casting a ballot, but the power of voting. We lost 2 giants this week, Reverend C.T. Vivian and who was just a kind soul and one of the most brilliant men, a theologian who could wrap his mind and your heart and soul around the constructs of freedom, the constructs of justice. And my dear friend, John Lewis, who lived his life as an open testament to the necessity of the fight. I wrote this book because I believe that we have reached an inflection point in our nation, one that is demographic, one that is operational, one that is ideological, and one that is a moment of exigency. We have the opportunity, those who share the value that opportunity should be equally accessible, who believe that the isms that affect and infect our nation should be vanquished, those who believe that we deserve to have leadership that sees us, hears us, and wants our success, not our demise, that now is the time that we can make that so. And so I wrote this book to really think through where we started, where we are, and most importantly, where we can go. And that's the reason for Our Time Is Now. It is certainly peppered with my story, but my story is simply there to create a through line for the larger narrative, because what happened in Georgia is not singular to Georgia. And what's happening in America affects the rest of the world. And if we don't understand the interconnectedness of this, but also the obligation and the access that we have to changing the future of the world, then we are lost. And so that's the right reason I wrote the book. And now I'm happy to talk about all the things I said and some things maybe I could have kept to myself.
Stacey, thank you so much for that, because I want to begin with this, because there are a few reoccurring threads in Our Time Is Now, and the many stories you share of folks leaving the long lines on election day, finding out that their polling location had changed and so forth. But what stood out for me, and I had never ever thought about this as it relates to voting, I had this wonderment about the trauma associated with not being able to cast a ballot. I had never really thought about that. But when you read these personal stories, which you continue to take the reader through, that's what came to me. When you were collecting all these stories and you decided you needed to put these stories in the book, did you think it would have a psychological effect on people? I'm just telling you how it affected me as a reader to hear these stories.
You know, as a storyteller, you know, as you know, I've written fiction and nonfiction. As someone who's in the public space as a, both as a politician and in the work I do, even as an entrepreneur, being able to tell stories matters. Because it's one thing to give people facts, but if you can't give them context, and if you can't give them the contours of the impact, then the facts have no real meaning. And so I've always tried to anchor, whether I'm talking about tax policy or voter suppression, you've got to anchor it in real lives. You've got to anchor it in something that's accessible. What was affecting to me was that as I told these stories, it was drawing on the experiences I had on the campaign trail. It was remembering and thinking back to how, Diamond, the young woman who fought so hard to be able to vote in Columbus as an 18-year-old, juxtaposing her with the cousin of Martin Luther King Jr., who was denied the right to vote for the first time since 1968. You can hear the narrative of voter suppression, but if you don't understand what it means for a citizen of our country to be told their voice is irrelevant, to be prevented from or discouraged from engaging and setting the course of the future, if you can't not just anchor it, but give it heft and texture, then it's just another bad thing that happens in America, but it doesn't propel you to action. And my mission, my parents used to say, it's, as I said, it's not enough to see a problem. Your job is to fix it. You can't fix a problem you don't understand. And the best way to understand it is to understand the people who are affected by it.
Stacey, the other thing that you do, and I had to go back because I wanted to absorb what your grandparents said to you about what they faced in merely trying to register to vote. And you immediately set the tone with the conversations with your grandparents. You immediately set the tone by letting the reader into what they faced as well. That was planned for you to put your own family's history in here?
No, so during the course of writing the book, the story about sitting with my grandmother was actually later in the book. And as I was writing that chapter about the history of being able to go and vote, I used it as an opening story. But when we were finalizing the book, one of my editors said, you need to move that story to the beginning. And she said, that's the story that needs to open this narrative. And I hesitated because, again, it was a story about me in the context. It was about my grandmother, but it seemed to, again, bring it back to my story, which I was trying to, I want my story to be there, but I don't want this to be the Stacey Abrams didn't become governor story. And so, but when I moved the anecdote, when I moved that to the beginning, it reminded me of that moment with my grandmother. My grandmother passed away in January of 2019. I sat with her and had this conversation in September of 2018. And it was the first time I'd heard that story because she had been ashamed for so long. And she was even ashamed of herself as she told the story. She was ashamed of her fear. She was ashamed of why she was reluctant. And, we're talking 1968 to 2018. It stayed with her. 50 years, this moment, as she saw it, of cowardice. And what I heard in it was this fear. And I remember how it felt when she was holding my hand, telling me the story, because my grandmother was dying at the time. She was in her 90s and she was frail, but she had this urgency to make me understand why this mattered. And for me, when they suggested I move it, it really brought me back to that moment with her. And it was a no-brainer. That had to be the way I opened this book.
On that note too, Stacey, our time is now is also a bit of an American history primer as it relates to voting rights and unlawful laws regarding voting. So besides the storytelling, you're also bringing facts, which we in my industry, we love facts. You're bringing facts. You're letting the reader know, okay, if you don't believe me, but I'm telling you some facts. Here's what happened back in, and you go way back. You talk about our founding fathers. You relate a lot of it to after the Civil War, the importance, tell our folks who are on this cyberspace forum we're having here, the importance of having that.
So, Rose, you know this about me. I wrote romance novels in law school, but I also am a tax attorney who had a specialty in tax policy because I also did a master's degree. And so I've always seen the juxtaposition of storytelling and fact-telling to be necessary, that you can't do one or the other if you want people to take your message with them. You've got to do both. And certainly during my time at the Capitol, part of my ability to navigate that space, to work with Democrats and Republicans and folks who were confused about which side of the aisle they stood on, was that sometimes the story didn't move them, but the facts, when you could get people to trust them, couldn't be disputed. And so for me, the necessity of including the factual history is twofold. One, you cannot fix what you don't understand. If you believe that voter suppression is the sua sponte creation of Republicans, that's wrong. Democrats have suppressed the votes. Republicans have suppressed the votes. The Know Nothing Party suppressed the votes. People in power tried to stop others from getting power. That is the through line of our history. And so I wanted that to be in there because I don't want people to be able to either dismiss it out of hand, saying this is just the rantings of a disgruntled Democrat, but I don't want Democrats to become so complacent as to think that, well, this is just their problem, and if we get rid of Republicans, all is well, because we haven't always been good actors either. And so I thought it was critical that we do that. But it was also critical that we understand that voter suppression, while it was perfected in the South and inculcated into law in ways that continue to reverberate, literacy tests were born in the Northeast, and they persisted in the West through 1975. And so we have to also understand that this is not a Southern problem, because often if you live in Wisconsin, if you live in Michigan, if you live in, in New Hampshire, you can dismiss the narrative of voter suppression by saying, well, that's a Southern problem. That's a racial problem. No, that's an American problem. And so it was important for me to not only contextualize the history, but also the breadth of the challenge. Because if you don't understand how big this is, then it's easy to get lost in the details and abdicate responsibility for addressing it.
Something else in the book that made me do a little research, and it was when you mentioned Dr. King's March on Ballot Boxes speech, I believe from May 9th, 1966. And it's a seldom talked about speech, but my goodness, Stacey, it is quite powerful about voting. And you said, I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, that it is one of your favorite speeches by Dr. King. It
is my favorite speech. I actually put it at the top.
And if folks, if you haven't, you should look it up and get a chance to listen to it, because personally, for me, I think it's one of his best speeches. Has an orator, I think, is one of his most powerful speeches. And to that note, it's very interesting because he mentions Georgia in it. He says one day South Carolina will be a better state, one day Georgia will be a better state. Fast forward though I want to shift to another historic moment, 2013. This is a key year because it's the year that you founded the New Georgia Project, a voter registration organization, but it's also the year the Supreme Court's ruling invalidated what was a key part of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby versus Holder. And you write that how that ruling spurred an onslaught of, and I'm gonna quote you here, of attacks from the Secretary of State who refused to put our eligible applicants on the rolls by Election Day 2014. Of course, then you're talking about Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp. How devastating was that Supreme Court ruling in 2013, Stacey, through your lens?
It has shifted. It took voter suppression, which has never fully gone away, and it not only put it on steroids, but it expanded its grasp. Because we have to remember, the 15th Amendment, so at the inception of our country, basically white men who owned land were permitted to vote. White men who didn't own land could aspire to the right to vote, but they were going to have a hard time of it. If you were Black, you weren't human. If you were a woman, you were invisible. You were to be silent. And if you were Native American, you were just invisible. Multiple times we excluded Indians from even the notion of participation in the United States narrative. Fast forward to 1870, we get the 15th Amendment, which grants Black men the right to vote. Get to 1920, white women get the right to vote. It wasn't until 1965 that everyone else got the right to vote, because in the United States, a constitutional amendment simply gives you permission to try. But it is the states who administer elections. And the seminal nature of the Voting Rights Act was that that was the first time states were held to account. That was the first time they were told it is not permissible for you to ignore the Constitution by creating these facially neutral workarounds so that you can reject access to the ballot of those you have deemed unworthy. And from the moment it was passed, there was a collective agreement that this was right, but there was always an undercurrent of anger about its existence. And even though the Voting Rights Act was renewed multiple times by wide margins and bipartisan fashion, after LBJ, it was Republican presidents who have signed every renewal of the Voting Rights Act. What happened in 2013 was the culmination of at least 50 years of attacks on this idea that everyone who is legally eligible to vote should have the ability to do so. And so when Section 5 was eviscerated, that section was the section that said that you could not take an action that would interfere with the right to vote without permission. And that pre-clearance was so critical because in most states, there's no do-over. Once the election happened, even if the election was, it was marred by suppression, marred by bad action, it's a rare occasion that there's a do-over of the election. And so pre-clearance was the only way to guarantee that bad actors were stopped before the crime was committed. And when we eviscerated Section 5, particularly in the South, because the former Confederate states were among the states that were held to account, although there are a number of states that actually were affected, and I go into that in the book. But in the South in particular, on the day of the Supreme Court decision, within 24 hours, Texas had opened the floodgates for its voter suppression activities. We saw what happened here in Georgia and across the South and around the country. The removal of the protection of the Voting Rights Act set in motion this retrenchment of voter suppression, and it has only grown more aggressive and more pervasive and more effective since that time.
So to that note, Stacey, if the reader, or anyone from that matter, but particularly for the reader, since we're talking about the book, does not understand the correlation between voting and democracy, does our time is now, does it lay the roadmap for someone to fully understand the relationship? Do you feel like you included everything possible to make the case?
I do, because I begin by addressing one of the sort of rhetorical devices used against me when I talk about this issue. That we're not a democracy. America's not a democracy, we're a republic. We're a democratic republic. But if you've ever gone to vote, you know we are a representative democracy. As a nation, we have determined that taking a poll every time we want to make a decision is kind of inefficient. It was inefficient when we were 13 states. It is impossible today. And so, unless of course it's American Idol, otherwise, we have determined that we are going to pick people who will speak for subdivisions of us, and that because of shared communal values, they can speak for us and help make decisions. We are a representative democracy. If that is what we are, then there is a direct connection to the ability to participate in picking those representatives. And anything that interferes with the lawful participation in an election, and let's be clear about what voter suppression is. Whether or not you are prevented from or discouraged from casting a ballot, particularly when the person or persons doing the discouraging act under the color of the state, but it can also happen through political parties. But we have to understand that when you prevent an eligible voter, you are segregating and separating that person from their constitutional obligation to participate in picking leaders, picking voices and representatives. And so the through line of the book is understanding why we have this process, why the process doesn't work for so many, but how we can reconnect. Because what we dismiss often as apathy is often a combination of apathy, cynicism, despair, and experience. And if we don't understand this through line, then we will never solve the problem. And the problem is, you should not be governed by those who do not see you, do not understand you, or worse, do their best to diminish you.
And by the way, we should note there's some breaking news. I'm always in journalist mode, but there's some breaking news out of New York where the New York State Assembly passed a bill that will make New York, I think, the 17th or 18th state to adopt automatic voter registration, along with the District of Columbia. It's hard to believe that in 2020 that it's only maybe a dozen plus states that have adopted this measure. When we started this conversation, you talked about C.T. Vivian and John Lewis. And when you think about 50 years plus of fighting and where we are in 2020, are you optimistic that the wrongs will be fixed? Or you obviously you still have some concerns, but are you a little bit more optimistic now because we're in this, everyone says we're in this space, we're in this moment where people are protesting and people are demanding change and this, that, and the third. So are you a little bit more optimistic about change will come as it relates to voting rights?
I am hopeful, but
Okay.
I'm hopeful with a large grain of we're going to have to make it so. I mean, look, I grew up in Mississippi, came of age in Georgia, lived in Texas, got confused and moved to Connecticut for a few years, came back south as soon as humanly possible. This is where I live. And I was born in Wisconsin. I revere the work of John Lewis and C.T. Vivian, of Joseph Lowry, who we lost earlier this year, of Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer and Coretta Scott King, all of those warriors who helped to give us the vote with the Voting Rights Act. But the moment we take for granted that the work is done, that is the moment the wrong starts to reassert itself and metastasize, and often, not just reground the wrong, but find new ways to make it so. Voter suppression in the 21st century is not the voter suppression of the 20th century, and we've got to understand that. But if we can understand it, and if we have a common belief that it is not right, that people will be denied their rights to vote, then yes, I believe that more is possible. I am hopeful that we can get things done, but I'm also very realistic that requires that we elect a president who actually believes in the right to vote for all eligible citizens, as opposed to one who tries to diminish and frankly lies about how voting works in this country. We have to have a U.S. Senate that's willing to take action on the kind of laws that New York just passed, because without automatic registration, it is going to continue to be nearly impossible for most of the voters who need to be on the rolls to join the rolls. And it is true that we have to have state legislatures in every state that actually participate in a redistricting process that allows voters to pick their representatives and no longer allows politicians to pick their voters. All of those are heavy lifts. And that's why I don't just write this book. It's why I didn't just create Fair Fight. I created Fair Fight to work on voter suppression. I created Fair Count to work on the census, which is going to affect redistricting and reapportionment. And I continue to work on policies, because all of this matters only if we get the policies that make our lives better and make access stronger.
Was there anything that you couldn't get into the book that you wanted to, that your editor said, Stacey, we're already at 400 some pages? No, my problem with my editors is never the length of my work. Hopefully readers will find I tend to be dense but succinct. Is there a different approach when you're writing about, and this is very important, we know, but everybody loves a good romance novel as well. Who doesn't love a good romance story? But is there a different approach, obviously, when you're writing about romance and falling in love, walking on the beach and looking across a crowded room and all that, as opposed to, writing about voter suppression? And
I mean, for me, it's the same basic skills. I sit down and do a deep outline. I try to figure out where I am, where I'm going, how I plan to get there. I then do a lot of research. I mean, my romance novels, one was, my first hero was a chemical physicist. Another was a cognitive scientist. I had one who was an ethnobotanist. So I've got to do a lot of research to write their stories well. And I think the same thing is true when you're trying to give people a roadmap for change. You've got to be intentional about giving them the information they need to make that change. I try to put in some interesting stories to keep people engaged. So, in the book, every chapter has a human moment to bring you into the facts, and then hopefully a human moment to help you think about how you can be a part of it. And the one thing is, in romance, I can guarantee a happy ending. I can't guarantee that,
Yeah.
but I can work for it.
Who should read Our Time Is Now?
Anyone who believes that our democracy is more robust when we can all participate, but also anyone who has doubted the evidence of their eyes. If you watched what happened on June 9th in the state of Georgia with the complete and utter collapse of our democratic process, and you don't think that voter suppression is real, this book is for you. But as a corollary, if you saw it and you wonder, is it inevitable? This book is for you. Because it's not inevitable. We can fix it.
So, and Stacey, you know me for some years now. Where do you feel you're most needed as a public servant?
Where there is a space for me to fill.
Will you run for governor of Georgia again?
I don't know.
Will you run for any seat again?
Yes, I will absolutely run for office again. But I think the last two conversations about me standing for office hopefully send a very strong and consistent signal. I don't think you have to be in office to do the work that needs to be done. I think there are certain offices that expand, deepen, or anchor your ability to accomplish the goals that I have. And there are some jobs that are absolutely essential, but it's not the job that I want to do. And I'm not the best person, because if you take a job in government, not because you believe it is the space you should be, then you are destined to not do the best work you can in that role. I do not want to be in the legislature of the United States. I don't want to go to the US Senate, and I did not want to go to the US House, but I will do everything in my power to ensure that we have the best people in both of those places. And when it's time for me to be back in public office, I will do my best to get there.
Stacey, I want to thank you for the comfort of this conversation, because we're now going to move the questions from cyberspace and great beyond. And so on that note, we're going to go to a couple of questions here, and bear with me while I get my little mouse and cursor. And Stacey, you knew that question was coming because you know me.
As you said, we've been at this together for a while.
Here's a question from Jill. I've never been actively politically, but want to help change the narrative. Where can new folks be most beneficial in the fight against voter suppression? That's from Jill.
Well, Jill, there's a group called Fair Fight. I launched Fair Fight, and there are two parts. There's Fair Fight Action, which is our 501c4. That's the entity that actually has sued the state of Georgia because our voting system is unconstitutional. It denies too many the right to vote, and that has to be changed. We have a political arm, Fair Fight 2020, and that began here in Georgia, but we're now in 18 states around the country. And if you go to fairfight2020.org, you can sign up to be a volunteer. You can volunteer here in Georgia, or you can volunteer in one of the states around the country. And because the challenge we're going to face in this election, particularly in the midst of COVID, is that people don't know the laws. I mean, I went to a pretty good law school, and it took me writing a book to have a handle on voting laws in America, and I still don't know enough. We are one of the few industrialized, democratized nations that fractures democracy into 50 different cohorts, within which each state can then fracture it further. In Michigan, there are more than 1,500 people in charge of administering elections. Georgia, it's 159, if you count just the people in charge. And so we need folks who are volunteers that we can deploy virtually to share information. It's how we were able to help the folks in Wisconsin when they faced the horrendous responsibility of casting a ballot in the midst of COVID, when the Supreme Court told them that their lives were forfeit unless, if they wanted to participate. It's what we did to send out texts and phone calls to 900,000 Georgians. But it's also how we helped get thousands of Georgians back on the rolls after they were unlawfully purged. And so if you go to fairfight2020.org, we'd love to have your help, and we can use your help not just in Georgia, but around the country.
And here's a question from the Minority Alliance organization, and basically they want to know they feel like young Black men have been left out of the voting process. How can an organization as themselves fix this problem and fix this in the minority community, I guess getting more Black men involved? Because he says it seems like 27% of Black men minimum already have no voice on a local or national platform.
So we have to, the way I approach this conversation is to begin by not blaming the victim. And so often we hear, young Black people, especially young Black men, are apathetic. No, it's not apathy. We have to connect the dots. We have to make certain that people understand, one, why voting matters, and two, what voting does and does not accomplish. Voting is not a miracle drug. It is not going to give us salvation, but it is going to thwart bad, and it's going to get us closer to good. But it's also critical that people understand at which level of government the changes they need to see can happen. I begin with and I talk about it in the book, there's a young man named Yellow Payne, who is a rapper out of Ohio, who does one of the most extraordinary jobs of deconstructing why voting matters for young Black men. And his video, I encourage everyone to look for it. It's Yellow Payne. He's on YouTube. What he does is he reminds us or explains for the first time how voting works. Most young people, especially most young Black folks, have never been in a civics class. And this is not something you learn by osmosis. When we watched Ahmaud Arbery's lack of justice stretch on for 74 days, to a person, I doubt most folks could have told you it was because the district attorney refused to take action and that another district attorney refused to take action, because most people don't vote for the DA. And so we've got to make certain that we understand that district attorneys make decisions about who gets charged, that mayors make decisions about who the police chiefs are and what the standard operating procedures of the police are. And so we've got to do the work of explaining how the system actually functions. On top of that, we've got to make certain that people understand what their rights are. If you are an ex-offender in the state of Georgia, it is nearly impossible for you to get back on the rolls. In fact, you cannot get back on the rolls until you fully satisfied your legal obligations. And those legal obligations can be completely opaque. In fact, the Southern Center for Human Rights is working on this, that we've got people who thought that they had done what they were supposed to do, but because 159 different counties get to decide whether you have met your obligations, it's nearly impossible for ex-offenders to navigate the space. So we've got to be able to help people understand. And the reason I think that's critical for young Black men to understand is that in the state of Georgia, we have the highest rate of Black people, actually the highest rate in the country of people on probation or parole. And if you're on probation or parole, you cannot vote in Georgia. And so it's making sure that we connect the dots, that we demystify the system, and that we take their hands and walk them through the process. That's why I created Fair Fight. That's why I created the New Georgia Project. It's not enough to want. You've got to put the pieces in place to make want turn into capacity.
And here's a question from Gina, who writes, what's the hardest area that you encounter when trying to get the community to vote?
Understanding that it's worth doing. When we were in the midst of the early stages of protest recently, it was frustrating to me to hear the admonition, don't protest, vote. I understood the good intention of that sentiment, but it's wrong, because the reality is protest is critical. It is how we tell those who've been elected to lead us. It's what we need. It is how we wake the conscience of those who've been, who have their own challenges or who have been immune to or inured to the worries and the issues of our society. Protest is part of who we are, and protest is necessary. But we also then have to not use voting as a slogan, Because when people hear just go vote, if you've lived in intergenerational poverty, you've seen election after election with no change. And it is disingenuous. In fact, it is dishonest to pretend that voting is going to solve that problem. But we have to be very clear that not voting will make the problem worse. And so what I wish we would say more to the community is that voting is like treating a disease. There's no miracle pill. You got to keep on the treatment. And if the moment you stop, the disease is going to become even more virulent and resurge. And so we've got to constantly take our medicine. Voting is our medicine. It's the medicine for tackling structural racism. It is the medicine for addressing systemic inequities. It is a medicine that if we stop taking it for a moment, the disease will return and it will metastasize and it will attack places we hadn't even thought were vulnerable. And if we want members of the community that do not vote to feel that they should vote, we've got to be honest with them about what they're going to get from that process. And if we don't tell the truth, then we not only lose them, we lose their household, we lose their community, and we lose our opportunity for progress.
Speaking of another demographic, Lorraine writes, I'm a high school librarian. How can I encourage my students to get involved? What advice would you give to those teenagers?
So one thing we did in my campaign, and it's something we've done in Fair Fight and Fair Count and in the Southern Economic Advancement Project, those are the 3 groups I've started recently. I believe in engaging young people early. Our campaign didn't just ask young people to be a part of it, we hired them. We also gave them resources and said, go do what you think you need to do. I'm 46 years old. I have no idea. I know there is something that it ticks or talks, and I welcome everyone to play there. That is not my milieu, and I don't intend. But because we treated young people with integrity, we armed them with information, and we gave them space for creativity. Our campaign saw a 139% increase in youth participation in the 2018 election. And so we have to not just tell young people, we need you to vote. We've got to tell them why their power is real. Because if they do that work, if they are willing to step out, if we are willing to step out with them and then step back and give them the space to be in charge, we will see engagement, we will see change. And I'm glad that you agrees with me.
I've had a couple questions here, Stacey, about, how do you also, I'm paraphrasing 2 and 1, how do we mobilize people, because we are in a pandemic at the moment. So how do you mobilize people to get out and vote?
One, you make it easy to vote. And so one of the things that Fair Fight is working hard on, you've probably seen or heard me talking about it, is vote by mail. Vote by mail is the safest, most accessible way to vote. It exists in every single state. There's not a state in the nation that doesn't do vote by mail, because UCAVA, which is the law that governs how our military votes, they vote by mail if they're stationed overseas. 34 states have vote by mail for the average citizen and no excuses. Anybody can use it. 16 states require some level of, you have to have some excuse, either disability, age, and sometimes just an inability to cast a ballot. If we get the HEROES Act will scale vote by mail for every state, and for the first time create uniform rules for who can access it. It won't make it any harder for anyone, and it will make it easier for a lot of folks. But we have to understand that if people know they can vote, they will vote, and we've seen it happen. We have seen record turnout in primaries across this country, and that record turnout is a great motivator for turnout in November. And so we make it easier to vote. We make sure people understand the rules of voting, and that's what Fair Fight is doing across the country with those volunteers. But we also have to make certain that we talk about the consequences of not voting, and not in the sort of dire, the world is not, the end is nigh, we will all be decimated if we don't vote, but more in the sort of proactive, positive way of saying, here are the things that we are talking about now, here are the policies, and here's what can be so. I don't believe you have to be enthusiastic about a single candidate. I want us to be enthusiastic about power. Voting is about power. And I have the power to pick someone who wants me to have the things I want, or I have the power to sit home and let whatever happens happen. I want us to be enthusiastic about the power to make things happen. And if we recast it as about as a power conversation rather than it being about a personality conversation, we will see more happen. Because when people believe they have power that folks are trying to take, they want to use that power. If you've ever had a 3-year-old or been around one, the toy they don't play with, they don't care about, but you let another child touch that toy, it is suddenly their favorite thing in the world. We need voting to become that toy, to be the power that people are determined to hold on to and determined to use.
Here's a question from Jan, who says, how can the Secretary of State website claim that you are giving out misinformation? How can this happen? Slander. I'm just reading.
So for those who do not peruse the Secretary of State's website very frequently, although he sent out a press release to everyone he could find, I guess it was last week, my days run together, we were made aware of a county that was refusing to accept absentee ballot requests by email. And we had not heard that the Secretary of State was doing anything about it. In fact, we'd heard the exact opposite, that they had been silent. And so we called on the Secretary of State's office to remind all 159 counties of the necessity of accepting vote by mail applications by email. The reason we felt it was incumbent upon us to push this out there and to demand it is that we have not seen a great deal of leadership from the Secretary of State on certain issues. And we didn't want him to claim that he didn't know. He took our admonition for him to do his job as an attack, and in response, he accused me of misinformation. There was nothing we said that wasn't true. There was a county not doing it. And shockingly, after our letter, he reaffirmed to all of the counties that they needed to accept vote by mail applications by email. So it worked.
Okay. We're just a few more questions, but I want to throw one in here too, because I actually have this question from a friend of mine who read the book too and said something that struck him was that hearing people say, I'm not going to go back and vote because my vote won't matter. Yeah. Because they were so just disappointed. And that was from both sides too, of the frustration with the lines and the absentee ballots. What do you say to those folks?
I say we're working on it and that we're trying. I mean, part of the story at the beginning of the book about my grandmother, I link it to the story of my sister's friend who, in the wake of my election, said she wasn't going to vote because her vote didn't matter. And I want her to understand, yes, it does. The reason I did not file a personal lawsuit to seek a challenge to the gubernatorial outcome in 2018 was that I knew if I made this about me becoming governor as the outcome of a lawsuit, then I would lose the people who thought that they were doing something for themselves or for their communities. I traveled this state, 159 counties, for almost 18 months, saying, if you will vote with me, then we can create things for all of us. The minute I made it about me and my personal, quest for the governorship, I would lose them, and more importantly, they would lose faith. And so instead, I acknowledged the legal sufficiency of the election, but I challenged the legal system that made that sufficient. And by doing so, I created the space to have this conversation so that people understand it's not about whether I get a job. It's not whether a politician gets a job. It's whether you get a person who speaks for you. And that's what we have to say, that voter suppression works not just when they block you from casting a ballot, but when they convince you that it's not even worth trying. Because yes, voter suppression is about stopping you, preventing you, discouraging you. But it's when it succeeds by convincing you that your voice is irrelevant, that's when it is so effective. And we know it's not, because on my side of the aisle, we got more votes than any Democrat in Georgia history, which is fantastic. But what was more fantastic is the composition of those votes. Young people who never thought their voices mattered. Latino and Asian American Pacific Islanders who came out and said, this is what we're capable of. African Americans in the state of Georgia who understood that they could increase their voter power, and now in 2018 and 2020 comprise 33% of the electorate. And more than anything, people who then felt compelled to demand that they get the support and the services they need, the ones who are willing to protest in the streets. That's how we get people to keep going out there and understanding that it matters, by showing up again and again and again, and not chastising them for their cynicism, but acknowledging it and asking them for their faith that if they keep trying and we try with them that we can make it so.
So that is what you want. I mean, it's great when it comes from Stacey Abrams, but like Leanne here is writing, she said, you know, what advice do you have for changing the minds of people who don't believe or who are not aware that the problems are as big as they are? I mean, I have people in my own family who say, well, all you got to do is register to vote. And then go vote.
So read the book, because then you can have some anecdotes to use. No, but it's important.
Yeah.
Like when people dismiss the voter ID, they're like, oh, everybody has to have an ID. There's stories about people who do exactly what they're supposed to and can't vote. Tell their stories. Talk about Diamond, a college student in Georgia from Fayetteville who had to have lawyers get her in there to vote because she did everything she was supposed to, but they didn't do their jobs. Part of the reason for the book is to arm you with those anecdotes, to give you the material you need. But here's my fundamental premise about arguing with someone. You rarely win.
Yeah.
I will argue. I begin by asking questions. Why do you think that? Why do you feel that way? And here's the trick. Listen. Actually listen to them. Hear them out. And then instead of trying to completely change their mindset, talk about their behavior. Because if the cost of doing a little bit more isn't that high, they may try it. But if you're telling them they're fundamentally wrong, they cannot hear you. My parents are pastors. Their job is to change people's minds and change their souls. I don't have that kind of time or that kind of patience. My job is to convince people that doing one thing more than they did before can get us one step closer to what we need. But we've got to be honest about how long the road is. And we've got to be intentional about giving them all the tools they need. And that's why I create organizations. That's why I've created New Georgia Project, Fair Fight, Fair Count, SEEP. I will create as many organizations as it takes to support you in your conversation with your cousin who tells you it doesn't matter. But if they cared about the death of Rayshard Brooks, you can convince them that at least Rayshard needs him to go out and vote, because if we don't do something to change it, it's only going to get worse.
And Stacey, as we wrap up, here comes the cerebral question, which I think is Sajana is reading my mind. The question is, what's that one piece of advice you would give everyone here today based on your own life experience?
Often I'm asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I am neither. I am an ameliorist. I made up that term to describe my political.
I was going to say, Stacey, spell that, because we ain't ever heard that word.
So ameliorate means to mitigate. You know, it's about mitigation.
That I know.
I know you do. So I've turned myself an ameliorist, and the way the craft shorthand I use is, look, I believe the glass is not half full or half empty. I think it's half full, but probably poisoned. And so my job is to find the antidote, because I'm going to get thirsty. And so we have to enter the world every day knowing that good is possible, but bad is not far behind. And our responsibility is not to worry and bemoan the possibility, but do everything in our power to solve the problem. I'm working on finding the antidote, because yes, the poison is there, but we're going to get thirsty and we're going to need to take a sip, and we need to be ready for the consequences.
I wish we could get to more of your questions. Again, a big thank you to Stacey and the Gwinnett Library, as well as all of you. You might see the head of my cat sticking out. I knew at some point he would get in the mix. But listen, if y'all want more information and to even see and hear more of these wonderful conversations, just visit gwinnettpl.org/Arthur Speaker. And for more information about Our Time Is Now, visit eagleeyebooks.com. Stacey, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Rose Scott, you are amazing. It is a lovely thing to hear your voice every day. And thank you for your service to our community and for taking your time to be with me tonight in conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Everybody enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.